There is a value in actual participants talking about the nature, at least, of what they did. And records aren't enough. I've written too many records myself to know that the juice is deliberately squeezed out of them.
Washington. Tense drama grips a hearing of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Before the bright light of publicity, Alger Hiss, former State Department official accused of being a communist, meets his accuser face to face, Whittaker Chambers, admittedly a former communist himself. Flatly contradicting one another, the two men sharply disagree on whether Hiss was ever a communist and how well they knew each other, on whether Hiss ever gave Chambers the use of a car, and other matters.
Chambers repeated his charges in a broadcast and was promptly sued for slander, which sent him to his Maryland farm to produce the famous pumpkin microfilm container, film allegedly made from documents supplied by Hiss, said by investigator Stripling and Congressman Nixon to contain top-secret information of vital import, shocking evidence of espionage in high office, a drama of contradiction with someone to be proven a liar.
In the end, I voted guilty. I felt very bad about the whole thing. But at the time, we all sincerely felt he was guilty of perjury, and we had no choice but to find him guilty.
Okay, tonight we're extremely fortunate to have what I think is going to be an excellent presentation. A graduate of Johns Hopkins University and Harvard Law School, Mr. Alger Hiss was appointed personal secretary to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And in 1936, he served in the Far Eastern staff of the State Department. In 1947, Mr. Hiss resigned from the State Department to become president of the Andrew Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served in this capacity until 1948, when a man by the name of Whittaker Chambers accused him of communist subversions. The trial, which many people have called one of the most sensational political trials in modern American history, was brought in 1949. In 1950, after a second trial, the first was a hung jury, Mr. Hiss was convicted of perjury. Recently, though, due to the new law passed, the Freedom of Information Act, Mr. Hiss and his associates have obtained a great deal of information in which they hope to reverse the decision made in 1950. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Mr. Alger Hiss.
Yes?
I'm confused on a few basic issues. First of all, who and why were you brought up on charges in the first place? What was your initial reaction after you were accused? And why is Alger Hiss the essence of the communist, McCarthyism?
I don't know, because I'm not. Now, I'm not quite sure what you are now asking me. I did have a sensational case. I assume you are aware of that. I was certainly not the only one attacked. I was not the only one convicted.
I'm not clear why this whole thing happened to you.
Well,
I actually came to this lecture to find out why Alger Hiss is so famous and why the case is so famous. How come you are the one that was convicted and they could only get you on perjury? What actually started this whole thing?
Let's start at the beginning, Mr. Stripling.
Well, in 1938, Congressman Dick Stein of New York was very concerned about the activities of the German-American Bund, particularly in New York and in New Jersey. And Fritz Kuhn had built quite an organization, and they paraded and stormtrooped around on weekends. And so he introduced a resolution to set up a committee to investigate the extent and character of subversive and un-American activities. And we started off by hearing the witnesses against the German-American Bund. I had never seen a Bundist. I had come from a little town in East Texas where there wasn't even a Republican. Then we got into communism. And tremendous interest developed throughout the country about the inroads of communism into all facets of our society. When we got onto communism, we stepped on a lot of toes. The liberal and element and communist element are so forth began to fight against the committee, including the president, including members of his cabinet and so forth. Normally, to have the animosity of President Roosevelt and his cabinet members against the little special committee would have annihilated it. Nobody was for the committee except the people. And the congressman just would not vote against it.
The Democrats were in control. Then the Republicans later took over, and at that time, Thomas of New Jersey, I think it was, came, and Dick Dixon was a freshman. Carl Munt was a senior member on that committee at that time.
Yeah.
And I asked to get on, and Sam Rabin didn't want me to get on. He said it would ruin anybody politically, and I told him, never mind, I'll take care of myself.
We were accused of being unfair and so forth, but yet even today, I don't know of anyone who could name me a person who was unjustly accused. The question of communism, that was, I refer to it as an apple about ready to drop off of a tree. Time was just ripe for it.
I was called to the meeting about, Carl Munt called me. He was an old friend of mine. He says, come to the meeting right away, Eddie. We've got him red-handed. I said, you have? So I get to the meeting, and man, all the Klieg lights are on in the meeting and all. I said, what you got, Carl? Teaching communism. I said, where, Carl? New York, in the Russian consul there, the Russian embassy room, or whatever they call it over there. I said, they were? Any Americans were there? No. He said, oh, of course not. I said, what's the difference? What do you expect to be teaching the catechism?
It is difficult today, when communist is a bad word, to imagine that in the New Deal we really didn't care whether people were communists or not. As long as they were doing their jobs, I saw nothing during the New Deal period which made me feel that the communists put some ideological goal ahead of the general goals of the New Deal. We thought of ourselves as radicals, the New Dealers I've been describing to you. I don't think we'd have minded, we certainly didn't mind being called communists.
We were profoundly concerned about the whole economic situation. We were still, the country was still in the depths of the Depression, of course, which really begun with the stock market crash in October 29, and the New Deal, as you know, was an effort to get the economy going again.
Because we thought the New Deal was a cohesive program, not a plan. It was completely improvised. There was no plan when Roosevelt was campaigning. There never was a plan later. But one of the statements Roosevelt made while he was campaigning was that he would experiment. If something didn't work, he would scrap it and try something else.
He promised to work for the man forgotten in the process of deflation.
And one of our favorite stories was of Roosevelt greeting the cabinet more than once by saying, "Good morning, fellow socialists," And Norman Thomas, when twitted in 34, 35, what's happened to the Socialist Party, said, Roosevelt stole our program. Well, it certainly didn't throw us.
Roosevelt was elected by an overwhelming majority, the first Democrat since Woodrow Wilson. As he stepped into office on March 4, 1933, he faced the most serious financial crisis the nation had ever experienced, with every bank in the country suspending payments, with black panic half a step away. The air was charged with drama as the inaugural began. Since Lincoln, no president had come to office under so dark a shadow.
From 1929 on, we had seen the country turn into a desolation. At that time, I suppose the total labor force was something like 60 million. So that if you have 15 million unemployed, that's a tremendous proportion, which we've never seen since. Schools were closed down because there were no funds. Without question, the intensity of the Depression was what convinced the whole generation of young middle-class people, which is what we were, that something had to be done. The Depression was all around us and a stench in our nostrils. There were Hoovervilles all along Riverside Drive. They had made shacks of tar paper, beaver board, whatever they could get hold of. And this was winter that I'm talking about. New dealers who came of age politically with the Depression and cared a great deal about labor organizing. Also were very interested in the Spanish Civil War. I myself thought of becoming a member of the International Brigade.
The call to arms of the socialist government, a call of desperation. The international situation is menacing. Germany, Italy, and Portugal said to be helping the rebels. Russia threatening to come openly to the aid of Madrid. The Soviets reported to be sending guns, munitions, and warplanes to the Spanish socialists. So General Franco commands, capture Madrid in a hurry.
New dealers were accused at one time of being premature anti-fascists. Crazy phrase. Fascism was never attractive. Then New dealers and people who proposed coexistence with the Soviet Union were called premature coexistentialists. I'm now thinking back, I never thought this way consciously at the time, that the demagogues in Congress we had to pay some attention to because they controlled appropriations. But we had no respect for them. We did not think they represented a majority opinion in the country, and they never defeated Roosevelt.
In former years, it has been British or French and a variety of other things. But this year, it's Russian. Desperate in mood, angry at failure, cunning in purpose, individuals and groups are seeking to make communism an issue in an election where communism is not a controversy between the two major parties. Here and now, once and for all, let us bury that red herring and destroy that false issue.
If Roosevelt was living, Hiss would not have been prosecuted, but when he passed, Hiss and the rest of the officials were doomed.
If his policies could be attacked unfairly, not on the merits, if his lieutenants could be held up to scorn and considered dishonorable, if one after another of the things he had espoused, first the New Deal, I was and am an unreconstructed New Dealer. The United Nations, I did play a part in the formation of the United Nations. I had been at Yalta, and Yalta was turned into a web of myths. Just amazing, the fantasies that have been developed in a hostile political sense about Yalta. I happen to fit those three categories. I think those who picked me miscalculated on another. I think they thought I was Jewish, so you could have also had anti-Semitism.
Greatest headlines of the century. Dateline, Yalta, February 3rd, 1945. An honor guard of Russian troops assembled at the airport to greet the famous statesman as they arrived by plane.
As an American, and I'm sure this was true of all the American delegation, we had a tremendous sense of pride in the way Roosevelt conducted himself. He had to be lifted from the belly of the Sacred Cow, his plane, which had an elevator that let down in the belly. First chance we'd had to see Russian reaction to Roosevelt. They showed tremendous respect. There's no question that he was the dominant figure.
Now the historic Yalta Conference could officially begin. Their initial purpose was to finalize the campaign for the total extermination of the Nazi war machine. The plans for a United Nations organization were clearly defined, and a provisional government was approved for Red-occupied Poland to be supervised by Russia. This despite the cries of outrage from Poles in London that no freedom could exist under communist domination. Russia was pledged to enter the war against Japan no later than 90 days after the German surrender.
We didn't have much in the way of bargaining power. The Russians had occupied much of Poland and were soon going to occupy all. This was clear. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Certainly possession is a large part of any post-war agreement. The Far East, we've heard a lot of comments that China was sold down the river. This was not the way we felt.
And here resurrected are the actors ominous and inspiring. Wyszynski, Marshal Stalin, Gromyko, Admiral Leahy, retiring Secretary of State Stadinius, and in the background, Alger Hiss and Harry Hopkins. President Roosevelt, incoming Secretary of State James Burns, and Prime Minister Churchill. World sympathy attended these films of President Roosevelt posed as the conference ended, while now the record haunts us.
Mr. Hiss, I'm having an exam on the Cold War tomorrow, and I was wondering if you could answer a question on Yalta for me. One of the arguments used to keep a hard line against the Soviets during the Truman era was that the Democratic Party, FDR in particular, sold out the American interests at Yalta. Mr. Hiss, you were at Yalta. Were we sold out?
No, but I don't think that's enough for your paper.
One of the major reasons for the Chinese communists coming to power as they did were the concessions that were made at Yalta.
There was spreading the belief that the United States had lost China or was being put at a disadvantage in other parts of the world by reason of the disloyalty, possibly, of people in that part of government charged with foreign affairs, namely the State Department.
One communist among the American advisors at Yalta was one communist too many.
The furor began when I think a variety of Americans felt that a change needed to be brought about in our political pattern. Roosevelt had been in office for 4 terms. The Republicans wished to come back in. This is normal. I think the hostility to communists per se began before the war was over, because the Cold War had early ramifications. It was clear from many talks I had with opposite numbers in the War Department that there were people of influence in the United States who considered Russia the ultimate enemy. If you look at the situation the world was in at the end of the war, you had 2 major powers who were bound to confront each other ineluctably. It would have been a little different if Roosevelt had survived instead of Truman.
We have no hostile or aggressive designs against the Soviet Union or any other country. We are not waging a Cold War. What the world needs in order to regain a sense of security is an end to Soviet obstruction and aggression.
Before a joint session of Congress, President Truman delivers his special message calling for a renewal of selective service, the draft.
The close of hostilities, the Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed the independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe. I recommend the temporary reenactment of selective service legislation in order to maintain our armed forces at their strength authorized.
But though no responsible American advocates attack on Russia, today America, by a massive rearmament program and by a new peacetime conscription program, has already demonstrated that in a world of continuing Soviet provocation, the nation's defense will no longer be neglected.
The Loyalty Security Board was set up in service of the Loyalty Security Program initiated by President Truman in 1947.
I think I know why he did it. It was pretty obviously, he thought, politically cute. He would take the wind out of the sails of the Republicans, but I don't think a Democrat can ever out-red bait the Republicans. If he tries, he's in trouble.
President Truman, looking at the political climate of that particular juncture, evidently found it advisable to check on the loyalty and security of the members of the government. I was one of the youngest consuls general in the service. My reputation was very high. The first report of Whittaker Chambers in regard to me apparently was given in executive session to the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1948. When he said that there was a man named Chubb who had visited the office of the New Masses in 1932. And he believed that I carried a message, though he didn't know to whom. The Loyalty Security Board, for all of my evidence, for all of the testimony of my witnesses, for all of the circumstance that they brought forth not one bit of concrete evidence to prove that I was a security risk, decided in the end that I was a security risk. And, the appeal officer reversed this, and I was reinstated to active duty, but I was reassigned to the Division of Historical Research. I was badly hurt. And I knew that my future was effectively crippled, and I made the right decision to leave. Chambers said that he had gone into the underground to serve the Soviets in June of 1932. But he was in the office of the New Masses on July the 9th, 1932, when I was there. and his name remained on the masthead as an editor or member of the editorial board of the New Masses until September of 1933. And I should like to see that investigated.
I was an editor on Newsweek, assigned to write the stories. And one of my beats was what they called at the time the subversive beat. The Hiss case was germinal in many ways. The country responded tremendously. It made Richard Nixon and eventually made him president. It led directly to the McCarthy period. If I were to try to explain Whittaker Chambers' role historically and ideologically, I would tell them to read the letter to his children, which is the beginning of Witness, or better still, I would play a recording of it. It's a very, very moving thing.
Beloved children, I am writing a book. In it I am speaking to you, but I am also speaking to the world. It is about what the world calls the Hiss Chambers case, or simply the Hiss case. It is about a spy case. But if the Hiss case were only this, it would not be worth my writing about or your reading about. It would not be what at the very beginning I was moved to call it, a tragedy of history. Much more than Alger Hiss or Whittaker Chambers was on trial in the trials of Alger Hiss. Two faiths were on trial.
I was transferred by Newsweek down to Washington, and I'd drive out to his farm in Westminster and spend the day just sitting on this beautiful old farmhouse, and you'd sit in the back porch, and there was this beautiful vista. His sense of humor, even at the time when things were so grim, he'd make jokes about it. I realized that he was affecting my whole life in the sense that he gave me a viewpoint of the great struggle in the world. We were in a period of Cold War then, but much more than that, a new understanding of what was at issue, understanding of communism.
Experience and the record had convinced me that communism is a form of totalitarianism, that its triumph means slavery to men wherever they fall under its sway, and spiritual night to the human mind and soul.
Friday, December 13th, 1940. And the heading of the entry is Counter-Revolutionary. Today in New York at the New Westin, I had lunch with Whittaker Chambers. He does not think that his years in the party were wasted. He learned the technique of the movement, and now he is going to apply that technique to destroy it.
This story begins on August the 3rd, 1948. On that day, the witness before the Committee on Un-American Activities, of which I was a member, was Whittaker Chambers, the $25,000 a year senior editor of Time magazine. When he came before the committee, he was an unimpressive witness at first sight, but he told a story that rocked the Capitol right to its foundations.
Whittaker Chambers, former communist underground worker who is now a senior editor of Time and Life magazines, tells of Reds who were government officials.
The head of the underground group at the time I knew it was Nathan Witt, an attorney of the National Labor Relations Board. Later, John Apt became the leader. Lee Pressman was also a member of this group, as was Alger Hiss, who was a member of the State Department, later organized the conferences at Dumbarton Oaks, San Francisco, and the U.S. side of the Yalta Conference.
And he went on to say that he had joined the party, Communist Party, in 1924.
A mutual friend of his and mine brought us together. He said that Whittaker Chambers was looking to join the Communist Party and was looking for someone to sponsor him. And would I be the one? He had a very hard and unfriendly relationship at home, particularly with his father. His father, he said, was a commercial artist, I believe an illustrator, J. Chambers, J-A-Y. His father was also a hidebound Republican. He said that he was the only one in the family who had advanced social and political views. He was prepared to go along with all the requirements of a party member.
He was the courier for a group of people in the government who the Communist Party felt would rise to high places in government. And once in those positions of government, they could be of great service to the Soviet Union.
The purpose of this group at that time was not primarily espionage. Its original purpose was the communist infiltration of the American government. But espionage was certainly one of its eventual objectives.
Right after Chambers finished his testimony, we received a wire from Alger Hiss asking for the opportunity to be heard on his side of the case. And so we gave him that chance just 2 days later.
A little exchange went on between Mr. Hiss and Mr. Nixon, which is not in the record, but in which Mr. Hiss said, "I am a graduate of Harvard Law School, and I believe yours is Whittaker." And this just absolutely ripped Mr. Nixon apart. And I realized from that moment on that he could not stand Hiss. And now Mr. Nixon was a Quaker and would give the appearance of being an even-tempered man. And very shortly thereafter, I was surprised one day, sitting in his office, and he said to me, he said, "Hiss, that son of a bitch is lying, that son of a bitch is lying." Just an outburst in which he just, in other words, it was more than, than just somebody saying, "I don't believe this guy, I think he's lying." He was just, he was just outraged. He's lying, son of a bitch, he's lying. And of course, I knew nothing about him being briefed by anybody. I didn't know anything about that he had any previous knowledge or had been tipped off about this.
When the Alger Hiss case came up before the committee, Mr. Nixon asked me if I could help him obtain information that he was not getting from the FBI on the orders of the Attorney General. And so I did, with the result that many of the interviews between Mr. Nixon and Mr. Hiss involved playing poker with a stacked deck.
Father John Cronin had done some investigating of the case and was closely connected with the House Un-American Activities Committee and was pursuing Alger Hiss as though it was a divine mission which he had to bring this terrible person to justice.
But the, what I call the really hardcore material was given to me informally, if I may use that word, by my friends at the FBI. And so the result was when they confront each other, Nixon had information that enabled him to break down Alger Hiss and lead to the series of incidents that finally led to his indictment and trial and conviction.
Because you obviously had a lot of time when you were in Lewisburg to reflect on what had happened to you. Are there any material aspects of your your defense either before the congressional committees or in your criminal trial, which you would have handled differently given the chance to do it again?
I certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about that, sometimes when I didn't even want to. The choices, which I knew very well at the very outset, were A, not to appear before the committee, certainly not to volunteer, which I did. And my friends advised me not to. B, claim the Fifth Amendment if subpoenaed.
I remember one witness took the Fifth Amendment on his own name. I asked him, "Was that your name?" He said, "I take the Fifth Amendment." Now that's how ridiculous it was. Now you're going to believe people who testify that way? I don't think so.
What about a man who claims the Fifth Amendment because he doesn't want to be put in the box of having to name his friends and put them through the ringer?
That's a man's own conscience, how far he wants to go. It all depends.
But there was no way I could answer about Alger without being asked about a host of other people.
Well, you had a witness before your committee named Henry Collins.
Yes,
and
I remember that.
You do? He was asked if he was a member of the American Legion. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that.
He claimed the Fifth.
Well, that's how ridiculous they'd come to back up the other claims of the Fifth he'd take.
But he's in a pickle because
What pickle is he in?
if he answers yes or no on that, then the next question is, are you a member of some other organization? And it gets closer and closer.
Well, of course it gets closer and closer. That's our business, to move him into the corner.
But then he has waived his privilege and he can no longer claim the Fifth.
Well, all right, why don't he want to waive a privilege? What is he ashamed of?
It's none of their goddamn business under our system. Unless, as I said, as I tried to indicate, it had to do with misconduct of some specific kind. Then the question was the misconduct, not whether you were red or white or blue.
What does Jefferson say? It'd be better the 100 people and
100 criminals go free.
Go free than one innocent die.
You agree?
No.
Why not?
I don't. Why not? Because you got to keep that board right in line. Somebody's going to get hurt.
And you'd be willing to sacrifice the one innocent man?
Yes. That makes me a horned frog or something, I guess. Everybody gets hurt, no matter what we do. The laws we live under hurt somebody.
On August the 5th, 1948, Alger Hiss was the witness before the committee. I would say that he was probably as impressive a witness as Chambers had been unimpressive at first glance. And when he had finished his testimony, the great majority of those who were in the hearing room were convinced that he was telling the truth and that Chambers was lying. Because this was what he said. He said, first, I have never been a communist.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
And second, and this incidentally proved to be his great mistake, he said, I have never known a man by the name of Whittaker Chambers.
To the best of my knowledge, I never heard of Whittaker Chambers until in 1947, when two representatives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation asked me if I knew him and various other people, some of whom I knew and some of whom I did not know. I said I did not know Chambers. So far as I am aware, I have never laid eyes on him, and I should like to have the opportunity to do so.
So the committee began, they wanted to apologize to him. They realized that in their own minds that they'd made a great mistake. That here at Chambers, some nut had come up and just blasted this very prominent man.
And so you see, at the conclusion of his testimony, many of us thought, well, how could it be possible for Chambers to know that Hiss was a communist if Hiss didn't even know Chambers?
Mr. Hiss did not categorically say, I have not seen, nor do I know this man.
I went away quite satisfied that the committee seemed themselves satisfied, but it was not to be.
Mr. Stripling, the chief investigator of the committee, and I, however, felt that it was necessary to investigate further. And we got permission to go to New York City 2 days later on August the 7th and question Chambers further. And in that testimony, which incidentally was given in the old federal court building at Foley Square on a Saturday afternoon in August, I grilled Whittaker Chambers, I think, as unmercifully as any witness has ever been grilled before a congressional committee.
Well, everything that Chambers said began to pan out. And it was obvious that Chambers had either made an absolute detailed study of Hiss's life, or he had hired somebody to do something. And so just somebody was lying.
At the conclusion of that testimony, we went back to Washington, and a few days later, on August the 16th, we called in Mr. Hiss.
Chambers said he is hard of hearing in his left ear and has a habit of cupping his ear. Well, while Mr. Hiss is testifying in executive session, once or twice he reached up and he did this like the ear. So I said to Mr. Hiss, I said, "Do you have difficulty hearing in your left ear?" And he said, "No." "Why? Why do you say that?" And I said, "Well, I just noticed that you cupped your ear." He said, "Well, I wasn't aware of it."
Was it so?
No. And once he had testified to that, I went to all the trouble of going up to P&S, having an ear specialist test my ears so that that could be used as evidence. Well, it came out that the reason he said that was that Mandel, who was one of the assistants to the committee, had said to him in the executive hearing, "I notice that when Mr. Hiss testifies, he sometimes cups a hand to an ear." I still do. If I'm eager to be sure I get exactly what's said, this is an old habit that I don't know which hand I would lift. But Mandel had noticed that I did that, trying to be sure that I heard what was being said from the dais. And so Chambers immediately grabbed that and said, "Oh, yes, he's deaf in one ear."
I said, "Now, Mr. Hiss, you say that you don't know Mr. Chambers. And yet we asked him these same questions that we have asked you. We got the same answers. Now tell me, how is it possible for a man who doesn't know you to know such intimate things about you?" Then, for the first of many times, Mr. Hiss began to change his story. He said, "Well, Mr. Nixon," scratching his head, "I've been thinking, and I do recall that back in 1934, I knew a man by the name of Crosley, George Crosley. Didn't know him very well. I remember that I sublet my apartment to him for approximately 3 months one summer. Incidentally, I just threw in an old 1929 Ford car that I had in the deal. I didn't need it anymore myself. I recall, too, that Crosley, his wife and small child, spent several days in our apartment with Mrs. Hiss and me before he moved into the apartment that we rented to them. Oh, yes, incidentally, he never paid me a cent on the rent. He touched me up for several loans that he never paid back. I do recall that he gave me a rug on one occasion, and on another, I recall that we went to New York together. We drove together, but I didn't know him very well. And I'm sure that Crosley couldn't be Chambers."
Chambers had testified at tremendous length, everything he could remember about Hiss. And he recalled that Hiss had seen a prothonotary warbler and had been very excited about it. And they just asked Hiss, sort of casually, they threw it in, and he corroborated it all. Now, how could Chambers, if he was a guy, the deadbeat, who hardly knew Hiss and so on, how would he know this? And this is what shook a lot of people. It's not really evidence. He might have met him once, and Hiss said, "You're a bird watcher, I'm a bird watcher, I saw a prothonotary warbler."
I was very pleased to have seen a prothonotary. As a matter of fact, I had seen one before, seeing him in his near native habitat near Washington. One appeared in Prospect Park, which I saw in 1931. Poor thing got stuck there during migration season. It didn't come too far north. I have no doubt that I boasted to Chambers, if that's the right word to use, or confided in him as I would to somebody on a street corner, that I had seen this quite rare bird. Rare for that area of the world, and not rare in Louisiana. But I have, with equal pride, talked of seeing pileated woodpeckers in Vermont, and if that was close to the time when I'd seen it, I would have been bubbling with it.
A sheer accident that this came out, and it convinced more people than yards of testimony.
So I said, did you have any hobbies? And so forth. And he said, well, I'm an amateur ornithologist, bird watcher. And that's when I kicked McDowell. We're sitting up on the dais, and the witness sitting in the well could not see us except peer up. And I just kicked McDowell under the table, and he caught the cue right off, and he said, I too am an amateur ornithologist, bird watching. I just wondered if you ever had the pleasure of seeing that rare bird, the thornetary warbler. And Mr. Hiss jumped up out of the chair, and he said, you know what, Congressman? He said, one Sunday morning, he said, I was walking on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, and I saw one, the most beautiful species you ever saw. Well, when he said that, I asked for a recess. And I said to the committee, I said, now, there is no way that Mr. Chambers would have known of that incident, in my opinion, if he had not had a close relationship.
I represented Alger Hiss for 2 weeks back in August of 1948. I told him some of the committees in Congress, in the House or the Senate, were, if you can use the word, trustworthy in the sense of not leaking what went on in executive sessions of their committee meetings, but that in my humble estimation, the House Un-American Affairs Committee was the most untrustworthy, and that he should not fall into the trap of taking a secrecy oath.
Now, at that meeting that day, very few, and just the staff and all, we physically lifted our hands. Physically lifted our hands and took an oath to God that nothing would be revealed from that meeting. I took that oath with the rest of them, hand high.
When Hiss came out of the committee room, he brushed all the reporters aside and came down the hall very briskly to me. And when he got to me, I asked him, Alger, aren't you going to talk to the newspaper people? And he said, no. I said, why not? And he said, well, when the testimony finished and the questioning finished, Congressman Thomas, who was chairman of the committee, stood up and said, I am now going to take a solemn oath of secrecy, Mr. Hiss, as are all the other members of this committee, and we want you to do the same thing. And I said, did you fall for that? Well, he said, I had no choice. I said, what do you mean you had no choice? You and I discussed this back and forth, and I thought you agreed with me that you would tell them nothing doing. Well, he said, I didn't want to antagonize them. Well, I said, I think you ought to go back and talk to those newspaper people and give them your version of what took place in that committee room. Or else tomorrow, everybody's going to read the committee's version of what took place. He said, well, I don't think they'll violate their promise.
I read the whole story in the next morning paper.
So without notice to either party, so that we could have the maximum element of surprise, the committee moved the following day on August 17th to New York, where both Mr. Hiss and Mr. Chambers had their offices. We rented a room in the Commodore Hotel, room 1400, incidentally, and in that room, we called both Mr. Hiss and Mr. Chambers and asked them to give testimony as to whether or not one or the other could recognize each other.
At or about this time, I picked up the newspaper or heard on the radio that Hiss had been confronted by Chambers at the Hotel Commodore. And as far as I knew, I was still his lawyer. But he had not seen fit to call me to tell me that he had been invited up there by one or two members of the committee to have a chat. And he walked right into the bear trap. He went to the Commodore by himself around 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, went to a suite, walked in, and there was Chambers and the boys on the committee were loaded for bear with the newspaper men in the hallway, and that was the great confrontation between the two, and his lawyer, myself, was at 63 Wall Street and didn't even know the meeting took place. Well, that ended it.
Now, I was not present when Hiss walked in the room in New York. Nixon went over there for the confrontation. And the story I get back from the meeting, Chambers was in the room, and as Hiss walked in, he said, "Hello, Alger," or something like that. And as I recall now, after all these years, Hiss walked all around and looked at Chambers, looked at him in the back, and finally says, "Open your mouth." That's true. Chambers opens his mouth, and Hiss looks down his mouth and all. He says, "Well, it's old George Crosby," whatever you call the name. Now, isn't that a ridiculous performance to put on to?
One of the distinguishing marks of Whittaker Chambers was his very bad teeth.
He had what must have been a steel backing for a tooth that had fallen away.
And I had said to him, "Whittaker, if you don't have the money or if you can't go to a dentist, I'll bring you to a comrade dentist."
I asked if I could see his teeth, if he would, because he was mumbling. And I was pretty sure that it must be the fellow, but he had not admitted that he'd ever used the name Crossley. So I asked if he had. He said something equivocal about, "Not to my knowledge," or "I don't recall."
I said, "Now, Mr. Hiss, do you mean to tell me that you would have to check with the man's dentist to see just what he did to his teeth before you could identify him as someone you knew as well as you knew George Crossley?" There was a dead silence in the room for at least 30 seconds.
The next step in this series was that the committee chose August 25th for a public confrontation. Well, this was obviously now a work of supererogation and a work of showmanship. Stripling, I think it is said that it was a circus. Well, it certainly was. It was held in the big caucus room. The Senate, it may have been the first televised hearing. It was certainly one of the first. And I remember a sense of the blinding lights.
Mr. Chambers, would you stand up? Mr. Hiss, have you ever seen this individual who is standing?
I have.
Do you know him?
I identify him, Mr. Stripling,
As who?
as George Crosby.
When did you know him as George Crosby?
According to my best recollection, and I would like to repeat that I have not had the opportunity to consult records of the time. I first knew him sometime in the winter of 1934 or 1935.
When did you last see Mr. Crosby as you have identified him?
Prefacing my answer with the same remarks I just made, I would think sometime in 1935.
In 1935 was the last time that you saw him.
According to my best recollection, not having checked the record.
Now, will you remain standing a moment, Mr. Hiss? Chairman, would you swear in Mr. Chambers?
You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God.
Mr. Chambers, do you know the individual who is now standing at the witness stand? Who is he? When did you first meet Mr. Hiss? 1934. When did you last see Mr. Hiss? 1938. Have a seat.
I first knew him as Crosley. What his name is today, I am not prepared to testify to, or what other names he may have had.
I asked him if he could name 3 people who knew George Crosley at the time he knew him as George Crosley. And he gave me 3 people. One was dead, one was out of the country, and one was unavailable. And so there was no way to ever tie the name of George Crosley into Mr. Hiss.
I received a telephone call, rather one of my counsel did, from someone, a woman, who said she had known George Crosley at this time, that she was fearful of getting her employer into Dutch or something by publicity. We were not able to trace the call. She may have been imagining. So far, the answer to your question is I have not yet been able to find any witness other than my wife who remembers him as George Crosley.
But once this issue had become publicly noisy, bruited about, a publisher named Samuel Roth got in touch with my counsel and said that Chambers, whom he had known, had sent him manuscripts under the name George Crosley. Chambers used, as many writers do, a number of pseudonyms or pen names. And Roth gave my counsel an affidavit to that effect. They decided not to use Roth as a witness. Whether that was wise or not is not for me now to say. I know the reason. He had been convicted of pornography. Now, Clyde E. Catlett, our cook, did remember.
A guy named Crosby used to come up here all the time. I don't know who he was or nothing like that, but he used to come there all the time. And I never cared much for him. I used to watch him because I didn't think much of him.
Did this Mr. Crosby ever live there?
No, I don't think he ever lived, but he come there. He never lived with them, I don't think. Or did he? On P Street he did, I think. He stayed there for a while. And he'd come there sometimes when they wasn't home.
It appeared, and was certainly used heavily against you, that you were unduly slow in recognizing Whittaker Chambers or acknowledging the association at all.
At the very first session, I hoped he would be present and asked. I was shown a photograph which had been taken apparently the day before from underneath. He had got much heavier, gained 40 pounds. I certainly wasn't going to testify yes or no from that.
Do you find any major deviations between the picture which I have just shown you, which is a current likeness of Mr. Whittaker Chambers, as we now know him, and the Mr. Whittaker Chambers seated over at the room?
Oh, it looks like moderately good likeness, slightly flattering, I would say.
Sit right down there, Mr. Chambers, and talk in the microphone. That's the one, yes.
Philadelphia in 1901, April 1st.
What is your present occupation?
I'm a senior editor of Time magazine.
Were you at one time a member of the Communist Party?
I was.
I was right there when Bert Miller issued him a little red card with places to put due stamps, and wrote it out in the name of Whittaker Chambers and put the party seal on it.
How long were you a member of the Communist Party?
I was a member of the Communist Party from 1924 until 1937 or early 38.
Ironically, this was the same Burt Miller who later turned out to be Ben Mandel, the research director for the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Would you detail to the committee the various positions which you held in the Communist Party?
Yes. I was at one time a writer on the Daily Worker, later a foreign news editor of the Daily Worker, later, in effect, managing editor of the Daily Worker, editor of the New Masses, and a functionary in the Underground.
Would you now give to the committee a chronological resume of your meeting of Mr. Hiss and how long you knew Mr. Hiss?
I believe that I was first introduced to Mr. Hiss by Harold Ware and J. Peters, who was the head of the Underground of the American Communist Party. The meeting took place in Washington, and I believe in a restaurant. I then continued to know Mr. Hiss until I broke with the Communist Party in early in 1938, and I saw him once again toward the end of 1938.
George Crosley came into my office in the Senate office building while I was acting as chief counsel to the Senate committee investigating the munitions industry. He represented himself as a freelance writer for magazines.
Did you ever meet Mr. Hiss at the offices of the Nye Investigating Committee in the Senate office building?
I never did.
You never did. Did you ever meet Mr. Hiss at his apartment on 28th Street?
I did.
Did Mr. Hiss ever sublease an apartment to you on 28th Street?
He did not.
He did not. Did he ever permit you to live in an apartment on 28th Street?
He did.
He did.
The apartment was not a gift to him. I offered to let him have it at cost to me, and he didn't have quarters. I thought this was as good for me as for him.
It seems to me topsy-turvy to be talking only about leases, Mr. Nixon, and such a serious charge as this. It seems to me we should be getting after the question of my record. What did people with whom I worked closely and intimately think of me?
Well, Mr. Hiss, I'd like to say again that the committee appreciates your suggestions as to how to conduct these hearings, but we do have certain questions to ask.
Then we began to go into the details, these housekeeping details, about the car, about the apartment, about the money, and all these things. And we had prepared our case well, and frankly, Mr. Hiss came out bad on that. And
well, what did all that prove?
Beg pardon?
What did all that prove?
All that proved that Mr. Chambers had been telling the truth, and Mr. Hiss had been avoiding the truth.
About what?
Well, for example, he said that he just threw in this car. He just gave that car to Chambers.
But he didn't remember giving it in the beginning. Keep in mind that Hiss changed his testimony too.
Did you ever dispose of that 1929 automobile to anybody else in any way besides to Mr. George Crosley?
Mr. Munn, I would hate to disappoint you in any expectation.
You have already done that, but answer the question.
I am not able without consulting the records, to testify with exactness or finality as to the way in which I ultimately completely disposed of my interest in that automobile.
Mr. Hiss, however, insisted that his old car should be given to the Open Communist Party to be used by some poor communist organizer in the West or elsewhere. I was very much opposed to this. Hiss was a devoted and at that time a rather romantic communist.
Well, Mr. Hiss turned the car over to the Turner Motor Company, but how do we know, how did you conclude, that Hiss had anything to do with what happened to it after that?
Well, we had the testimony of Whittaker Chambers that what he wanted to do was to give it to the communists.
I certainly urge this committee not to follow any hit-and-run tactics, to keep right after this issue of who is Chambers, of what credibility to give to his fantastic testimony. I shall do all I possibly can, whatever it costs me, within my means, to get at the truth.
Either Whittaker Chambers or Alger Hiss were lying. There was no doubt about it. They were both telling exactly opposite stories under oath. So one of them had to be a liar.
Mr. Hebert accused me of agility. I accept no accusation except that of truth.
Mr. Hiss is lying.
Mr. Hiss is lying. My action in being kind to Crosley years ago was one of humaneness, with results which surely some members of the committee have experienced. You do a favor for a man, he comes for another. He gets a third favor from you. When you finally realize he is an inveterate repeater, you get rid of him. If your loss is only a loss of time and money, you are lucky. You may find yourself calumniated in a degree depending on whether the man is unbalanced or worse.
Well, I felt I had been used financially. He never paid the rent he had promised. When we had lunch, I was always the one that picked up the check for the small bill we'd eaten. And I just decided that he was what, as a youngster, I'd called a moocher. And so eventually, when he called me on the telephone one time, I said I thought we'd better discontinue seeing each other.
Was Alger Hiss paying party dues to Chambers?
Did you yourself have occasion at any time to pay dues to Mr. Hiss?
I did.
He didn't because Chambers was not in the party himself. Chambers, even if he was a so-called courier, it was not a courier for the party. It was a courier for what he says was a spy agency, an espionage
organization of the underground. There should be no communication between the Open Communist Party and the underground Communist Party, except through people delegated by either of those sections.
Anyone employed by the Soviet government agency in any capacity, we were told, was strictly forbidden to even attend Communist Party meeting.
You described the committee, Mr. Chambers, the last time you saw Mr. Hiss.
About 1938, toward the end of 1938, I tried to break away from the Communist Party. A number of people. It seemed to me the time was coming when I would have to do something about this problem. It also seemed to me proper that they should have an opportunity to break away themselves. I had once been a communist. I broke away. The possibility is always there. And I went to Mr. Hiss. He was then living on Boulder Place, and I had supper with him there, with his wife, and in the course of that, I tried to raise my doubts and detaching from the Communist Party. I failed.
Well, now, why did you go to see Mr. Hiss?
I was very fond of Mr. Hiss.
You were very fond of Mr. Hiss?
Indeed, I was. He was perhaps my closest friend. Mr. Hiss was certainly the closest friend I ever had in the Communist Party. The story is spread that in testifying against Mr. Hiss, I'm working out some old grudge for motives of revenge or hatred. I don't hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting. I've testified against him with remorse and pity. But in the moment of historic jeopardy, in which this nation now stands, so help me God, I could not do otherwise.
In all the time I knew him, I never heard him say one unpleasant word about Alger Hiss. Obviously, there'd been a very deep relationship. And he felt Alger was on one side, he was on the other. They were taking the historically opposing viewpoints, but he respected him as a Bolshevik.
This committee never had any illusions that we would be able to prove definitely whether or not you are a communist, because in dealing with people charged with being communists over a period of years, we have found that those who are guilty refuse to admit it and dodge the question or deliberately lie. Were you a member of the so-called Ware group, who are alleged to have worked together to promote their associates into key positions of government? You say you were not. Mr. Chambers says that you were. Mr. Chambers said that you were, and that you were associated in that activity with John Apt, Lee Pressman, Nathan Witt, Henry Collins, Harold Ware, and Charles Kramer.
I don't mind being called a communist. It's never bothered me.
You admit that you knew John Apt, Lee Pressman, Nathan Witt, Henry Collins, Harold Ware, Charles Kramer, but you do not know whether or not that they were communists, and that whether they were or not, that you were not associated with them in an effort to promote your associates in the key government positions.
Whittaker Pressman testified, I think that was in 1950, that he had been a member and named me and Kramer and Apt as members, but said that he didn't know Alger as a member. It validated Chambers in the sense that he agreed with Chambers that I and Kramer and Apt were members of the party. It validated Alger in the sense that he said that Alger was not.
It was 1939 when Whittaker Chambers first made his charges against Alger Hiss. He went to A.A. Burley, an assistant secretary of state.
A good many people think that there was a vendetta and that Chambers spent his time trying to get Hiss. Well, he was dragged by Isaac Don Levine to see Burley in 1939 after the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and was sure he was going to be arrested immediately.
Don Levine was a very close friend of Benjamin Mandel, who was my director of research. It's very possible that Mandel told me of Levine arranging for Chambers to try to see Roosevelt.
Chambers told Burley that there was a large ring of espionage, you know, in Washington.
He could not remember telling Burley about espionage. He thought that he got that information from you. That's what he told the FBI.
A total lapse of memory.
Well, Isaac Don Levine was very much concerned with fighting the communist issue in the 1940s, to the extent that he raised some of the money and became editor of a magazine called Plain Talk, which was an effort to disseminate the communist problem to the public on a level of sobriety and restraint and scholarship.
And I was his first managing editor, and I designed the magazine and ran it for a while, and then quit because he wasn't paying me enough.
I, in turn, was deeply interested in it and was able to secure some funds to help it go.
I never doubted for a moment, to this day, that Chambers told the truth. He never gunned for his...
But why does that bear on whether Whittaker Chambers was telling the truth?
It simply means that he was telling the truth because he was telling the truth to my ear, which happened to be a very well-attuned ear to lies. He did not lie in that, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't lie on 7 other occasions.
In 1939, 41, 43, 45, and 47, Chambers told the story again to agencies of his government. And nothing was done.
Never, under no circumstances, could Chambers have been the big shot, the key member of the intelligence group.
He boasted about his underground work. He was the most open-minded, overt secret agent I have ever heard of. He was. He went around. I would meet mutual friends who would say, you know about Whittaker, he's working in the communist underground, or he's working for the GPU or something. People who shouldn't know about these sort of things any more than I should know about them.
At that time, because there was this whole question of Trotsky.
But what does this have to do with Whittaker Chambers?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because Chambers had constantly said while he was working in the in the Daily Worker and New Masses, that he was an independent political oppositionist. He sympathized with Trotsky at the time that Trotsky was expelled. He denounced the so-called Stalin purges. And do you mean to say that the Soviet agency would not have been aware of his political outlook? And he would have been the last person in the world to have been engaged as any kind of a courier of informant.
If you then thought Chambers was lying, why did you not come forward and say so? back at the time of the trials in 1949 and 1950?
Wow, that's the thing that I pondered and turned over in my mind so many times since that time. I was not an important figure or any well-known figure.
But you knew Chambers.
Yes. But also, and I'll get right to the point on this, I don't want to deny at all that I was very much concerned about the question of whether or not Chambers was also going to finger me as having been his sponsor in the party.
For the first time in my life, I had thought I had achieved a position where my career really should be, and I loved it to be, at the United Nations. You know, I'd been other things too. But somehow or other, none of them meant to me, but working for the United Nations meant to me. It was really terribly important for me, personally. He deprived me of it. I was in Columbia with Whittaker Chambers. I think he was in the class of 1924 and I was in 25. Or we may have both been in 25, I'm not sure. In any case, he belonged to the circle of which I formed a part, most of whom were members of 24. Mike Shapiro, Lionel Trilling, editors of Morningside. And mostly were most of the contributors to it, including Chambers. We weren't intimate, though I knew him and we knew each other. I was sitting eating, and Whittaker Chambers sat down on a nearby table, and I was with somebody else, I think, a roommate perhaps. And he picked up a bottle of ketchup.
Whittaker Chambers.
Whittaker Chambers picked up a bottle of ketchup on his table and swung it, I don't mean released it, swung it open towards me so that I was all spattered with ketchup. Which is, if anything was ever seemingly unmotivated, this was it, because we hadn't even exchanged any words. That's so unimportant, yet it's very funny that I remember it now as a foreshadowing of what he was going to do to me eventually. So I knew him in school, and then I didn't meet him for many years later until the 1930s, I guess. What he actually asked me for was to serve as an intermediary for the passage of messages. Somebody would leave a letter with me and I would give it to somebody who came and got it. And I did deliver the letter to somebody who came and called for it. That's all that happened.
What was in the letter?
I don't know. I didn't open the letter.
Did Whittaker Chambers say anything about the purpose of this?
Yes. It had to do with underground work against Hitler. Years pass, all of a sudden, Whittaker Chambers appears before a Senate committee. It seems that I had organized a fake publishing company. I never engaged anything like it. I was never asked to do anything such thing, and he has me doing it.
What for, did he say?
As a cover for something or other. And I told him what I had done and what my contact with Whittaker Chambers was. Mind you, that was that one contact, leaping over years since we were in school together.
What were your own political views at the time?
With Hitler, with maybe the beginning of the Spanish War, it just didn't seem credible to most people that I knew not to be radical, not to be radical in sentiment It was the common way of doing things. It didn't mean necessarily that you were a communist or that you even read the Daily Worker or even the masses. But a lot of people read the masses, you know. Especially in literary circles, I would say, it was a widespread feeling. And on top of that, there was something that I mentioned to the committee, I think, when I was queried about it. There was the ineluctable fact that I was a Jew. That was what Hitler was about. That couldn't be overlooked either. So that anybody who raised a banner to fight Hitler seemed to be the man to follow and the man to help. That was the climate of the times as I remember them, and it still seems to me unobjectionable. How could you object to it? It was true. The immediately following history proved it was true, because then we had the war against Hitler. Not against communists, but against Hitler. Well, that was the end of my career with the United Nations.
Chambers boasts that he tried to disrupt every underground activity that he knew about after leaving the party, and that although he wants me to keep the information quiet, he has turned it over to the proper sources. The counter-revolutionary purge is still to come, he said ominously. He believes that conspiracies, traitors, and spies surround us on every side, and he is determined to wipe them out.
Mr. Chambers says that you knew him as Carl. You say that you knew him as Crosby. To me, that isn't a very important distinction. The important thing is how close your associations were with this man, who was admittedly a communist at that time. He was a communist functionary. But he was living in your home as George Crosby, or Carl, or Whittaker Chambers is comparatively immaterial. The important thing to me, Mr. Hiss, is that he was living in your home, that you were associating with him, that you were taking him out in your car, that you were loaning him your car, that you were letting him use your apartment and making him loans, and having associations with him of that nature.
Commenting on Mr. Munt's so-called summation, I would like to point out that the man who calls himself Chambers has, by his own testimony, been peddling to various government agencies for 10 years or so stories about me. I would like to repeat in a public session, what I said in New York at the executive session where Chambers was present, and I said it in his presence. I challenge him to make the statements about me with respect to communism in public that he has made under privilege to this committee.
Now, prior to this, in executive session, repeatedly I had said to Mr. Chambers, Mr. Chambers, you could not possibly have been involved in this kind of operation for the period of time you were without having some kind of documentary evidence to substantiate what you're saying. And he never had to answer. He had a kitchen matches always in his pocket, and he was always smoking a pipe. All he'd do is reach in, get a kitchen match, and start lighting that pipe. And Mr. Nixon would say, Mr. Chairman, I think counsel has been very unfair to the witness. I think he's been very candid and very open with us, and I think it's very unfair for counsel to accuse him of withholding information.
Hiss, once this testimony became public, felt that it was necessary to vindicate himself. He had first said he didn't know the man, and then he had to admit knowing him under these rather unusual circumstances, and so he sued Chambers for slander.
I have learned from his own book and from others that once the libel suit was filed, on the ground that he charged me with being a communist over the air, his lawyer said, look, if you can't come up with something, you're going to lose this suit. After a delay, which I think was at his counsel's request, on November 17th of that same year, he suddenly produced a lot of typewritten documents, which he said had been typed, he first said, by me or by my wife. Then he later learned that I couldn't type and said my wife had typed the documents. And the material he introduced represented the first time he ever said he had been engaged in espionage activities with me. From then on, the typewriter became important.
When he submitted those 64 pretrial documents, he thought that the FBI would go into, full charge and really go after this case. Well, it had been 2 weeks and nothing happened.
On December 3rd, 1948, just a couple of weeks after Chambers had produced the typewritten papers, he produced for Stripling, who was the chief investigator or the director of the House Committee, an American committee, 5 rolls of microfilm, which were called the pumpkin film because he took them to a pumpkin patch by his farmhouse in Westminster, Maryland, took the top off, and here these had been waiting such a dramatic exposure.
I knew that Mr. Nixon had been going up to see Mr. Chambers. I knew that he had been going up to see him with Mr. Andrews all during this hearing. Now, I wrote the first book about the Hiss case when I left in 1949. It was about the Committee on Un-American Activities, but there's a chapter in there about the Hiss case. I cited the name of Nicholas Vazana, who was representing Whittaker Chambers in the libel action which was taking place at a pretrial hearing in Baltimore, as a man who came to my office and said, I can't go into it, but if I was Hiss, I'd come into it. And I said, well, something happened in Baltimore? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, did it involve documents? And he said, well, I'm not supposed to tell you, but it did. Well, I realized that on the face of it, this would not look good, that the counsel for Mr. Chambers would come and tip us off about something. But when you're investigating a matter, a fact is a fact. So we go up to Nixon. The office is on the 5th floor of the same building I'm on. And I go in and I introduce him to Vazana. And I told him what Vazana said and so forth, which I thought Nixon would just be ecstatic about this. And I thought it was a big break. But I said, I'm convinced to break this case. And he said, I am sick and tired of this whole damn case. I am leaving tomorrow morning with Pat, and we're going to Panama Canal. As far as I'm concerned, I don't give a damn what happens to his case.
On December the 2nd of this year, I served a subpoena upon Whittaker Chambers, and I asked that Mr. William Wheeler, investigator, take the stand.
We went to Mr. Chambers' house, and he was looking for a flashlight. He could not find one. He turned on the yard lights. We then went out into this field, and he picked up several pumpkins and put them back down. He picked up one. He says, here is what you're looking for. And he pulled the top off of it and handed it to me. I reached in and pulled out the material.
Well, of course, finding the stuff in a pumpkin, I realized the ridiculousness of it and so forth. But here again, this was a fact. This is where they were. So then I called the chairman of the committee and I told him what we had. Now, this was Thomas, and he was in New Jersey, and I said, Mr. Thomas, since you're under indictment and so forth, you realize you cannot preside this hearing. And he said, I realize that. He said, call Mott and appoint him chairman and so forth. And then he said to me, he said, what are you going to do about Nixon? I said, well, he's on the boat on the way to Panama. And he said, leave the son of a bitch on there. And then he said, well, I'll leave that up to you, Strip. If you want to try to bring him back, okay, but if I was you, I'd leave him on there. You got to understand, as I said before, the job that I was in was like working in a sewer. I mean, it was the type of thing that somebody had to do, and I did it.
Nixon made great use of those films. He waved them in front of television cameras.
New evidence of communist activities in government circles is promised by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Microfilm reportedly found in a pumpkin on a Maryland farm is examined by investigator Stripling and Congressman Nixon, who says,
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of the most confidential, highly secret State Department documents. This microfilm was made for the purpose of transmitting these documents in reduced form to the Soviet Union. The documents were obtained from State Department employees who were communists and who were interested in sending those documents to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union were in direct conflict with the United States. That it is the intention of the Committee on Un-American Activities to pursue this investigation until we put the spotlight on those high officials in the State Department who are responsible for selling this country down the river.
Chambers gave me a lot of dope on the CP Underground. He said that it had its people all through government service, and that Nathan Witt of the Labor Board is the only one who has so far been forced to resign. Sayre, Francis B. Sayre, the High Commissioner to the Philippines, is also connected with the underground movement. Chambers had not merely said that Francis Sayre was connected with the communist underground, but that he was head of the communist underground apparatus in the State Department. What I said was not Francis B. Sayre, not Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law. And Chambers said, yes, exactly that man. He's head of the underground apparatus.
Now, it is my belief that Chambers was playing at being an espionage agent. It was an impostorship. One of his major sources of information was Julian Wadley. He was with the State Department. Julian Wadley, in the articles he wrote for the Post and in his testimony, said he thought the only people who were really against the Nazis and the fascists were the Russians. Chambers said, you give me documents and it'll help the Russians, so Wadley did it. Now, the documents he got from Wadley were certainly as useful if he was going to make up a story about Mr. Sayre as they were in making up a story about me, because we were in the same office. I was Sayre's subordinate. I should mention that when Chambers produced the typewritten documents, he also produced 4 tiny slips of paper on which there were pencil handwritten notes by me. They had been creased, pretty clearly discarded. How Chambers got them, I still don't know. The actual Baltimore documents, while dated in 1938, obviously could have been typed at any time. They did not have to be typed at the time of the dates. All he had to do was to get from the State Department copies of old documents and typing them on an old machine, make them look as though they were contemporaneous.
Could he have gotten copies 5 or 10 years later?
Oh, he could have got them much later than that. After all, documents are retained in the State Department for a long time. He may even have got some that had already been transferred to the archives and put on microfilm. And he certainly had people whom he knew well in the State Department who assisted him. There was that man Mandel, who was on the committee staff, who worked in the security office of the State Department for a period of time.
Former Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles and Congressman Munt of the Committee on Un-American Activities. The testimony concerns microfilm copies of secret State Department documents. One after another, Sumner Welles declares they should not be made public.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that this document also, if published now, would be prejudicial to the nation's interest.
There were included among those microfilm documents a memorandum of the Navy Department to all ships in the service, informing them that thereafter fire extinguishers were to be painted a certain color. I don't recall what it was, but this was hardly a matter of great moment to any communist spy, and would not be very helpful to the Russians if they had this information.
The Baltimore documents consist of a real mishmash, kind of stuff that the department would normally have released to American exporters and so on about conditions in Manchuria. There were, however, either exact copies of some cables or excerpts from cables, a number of which were certainly in confidential code.
Was that furnish the individual with the necessary information to break the code?
In my judgment, decidedly yes.
Immediately, committee investigator William A. Wheeler rushes the new evidence to a federal grand jury in New York investigating espionage. Ex-communist Whittaker Chambers, whose farm produced the film-stuffed pumpkin, arrives to testify before the jury. Former State Department official Alger Hiss, who is suing Chambers for libel, will give his private testimony as the spy probe is on again.
Shortly thereafter, after this pumpkin situation, the grand jury indicted Mr. Hiss.
I remember very well coming back after my last appearance before them, being in Ed McLean's office. He was my chief attorney of record. And Ed said, "Sons of bitches, they used perjury when they couldn't indict him for the real charge." The real charge certainly would have been espionage. The statute of limitations for espionage is 5 years, or was at this time. The events I was compelled to testify about had all occurred, Chambers said 1938, 10 years before. I had denied ever giving Chambers any official documents and had said that I had not seen him after January 1st, 1937. All the documents are dated 38. What they had done was to indict me for perjury, simply for asserting my innocence. This is an evasion of the statute of limitations.
Behind the stately pillars of this New York federal court, the compelling drama of the Hiss-Chambers charge and denial trial proceeds apace. And Alger Hiss, looking the composite of a typical young American intellectual, stands charged with perjury, presenting a legal maze for Judge Samuel Kaufman conducting his first big case, while Special Assistant Attorney General Donegan with U.S. Assistant District Attorney Murphy act for the prosecution. A task made more difficult by the admission forced from accuser Whittaker Chambers that he himself committed perjury.
Almost immediately that he began cooperating with the government, it was plain that he was subject to prosecution. He admitted having committed a dozen or more perjuries. The grand jury wished on their own, what lawyers call sua sponte, on their own initiative to indict him for perjury. The prosecutors prevented them from that, quite frankly saying, as Nixon did publicly, why, if you indict Chambers for perjury, there is no case against Hiss.
The judge, in his charge to you, to the jury, said that Whittaker Chambers tells you that his testimony here, the first trial, is true, and that on all those other occasions on which he swore to the contrary, he committed perjury. Did that influence your view of his credibility?
I wasn't aware of former perjuries that Whittaker Chambers made. I was not aware of that.
Well, that raises the question of any lawyer when he's testifying. He'll admit that he lied before, but he ain't lying now. But next week he'll admit, well, I've been lying before, but I ain't lying now. I'm telling the truth now.
Well, I was convinced even before we went into those deliberations because I did believe Chambers' testimony over Hiss's.
And did you think that Alger Hiss was a communist?
No, I didn't. I just felt that he was more or less one of these one world people that everybody should share everything. I don't think he was ever a communist. Of course, at that time that trial was going on, there was also another famous trial going on at the same time in the federal courthouse. There was a time Judge Medina sat for 11 months where they had the trial of the 11 communists. That was going on at the same time in the same courthouse. When we started deliberations, we got some of the government evidence, such as the old typewriter, which the defense admitted belonged to Alger Hiss. And also a lot of copies of documents. They were not original government papers, but copies of papers that were retyped. And also in that evidence was some private papers that were written and typed by Hiss's wife.
Well, I was a special agent document examiner, and my headquarters were in the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. I did all of the documentary work for the government in the Alger Hiss case. I concluded that these State Department documents, excerpts thereof, were typed on the same typewriter as two letters which were purportedly typed on the typewriter in the Hiss household.
How did you reach that conclusion?
Well, they are drop-offs of letters, or they are images that appear in the letters that are not clearly formed, like the formation of the G. All of the letter G might not be shown on the imprint. And I have never, in my experience, seen two typewriters that would make exactly the same perforations that had the same defects. I have never seen a machine that was an expert forgery.
If it was successful, you would not know.
If it was successfully accomplished, I would say that I would not know, but I've never seen it happen.
Let me ask you another question, and this deals with pencil notations or corrections on the questioned Baltimore documents.
The corrections that were made in longhand on the question documents in the Hiss case, they were limited to 1, 2, and 3 letters, and sometimes just in commas. And under those standards, I think a person would be going to the nth degree to reach any conclusion one way or another, and that I didn't do.
Now, I believe all they were trying to bring out on the trial was that those documents were typed on that typewriter. But our point was that the documents were not only typed on a typewriter, but typed by Mrs. Hiss.
I interviewed Remus Fian, the FBI document examiner at both trials, on that question last year, 1977. I'd like to show you a part of that interview.
You know, I don't remember of Tom Murphy, the prosecutor, asking me during the first or the second trial if I thought that Mrs. Hiss was responsible for the typing of the question documents.
And if he had asked you, what would you have said?
I'd have said that I was not able to reach a conclusion. There was nothing that, in my examination of the documents, that would lead me to a definite conclusion as to who typed the documents.
He disagreed. Well, maybe that's why it wasn't brought out in the trial. But to me, it appeared that the same person had typed the government documents as typed those private letters that Mrs. Hiss typed. That's my opinion. However,
but
in my state, we were trying to convince 4 stubborn jurors to our way of thinking. In fact, after the trial was over, some of the jurors did contact Murphy and talk about it and mentioned that fact that we almost had them convinced using those documents because of the errors in them that were corrected. But I don't think they used it in the second trial or not. They didn't put too much significance to it.
Well, here is an FBI memorandum of that meeting of your fellow juror, Frederick Gaffney, with the prosecutor, Thomas Murphy, after the first trial and before the second trial.
Gaffney stated that one of the observations noted by Vincent H. Shaw, another juror, might be of some benefit in the preparation of the retrial of this case. According to Gaffney, Shaw observed that there were several typing errors in the Bryn Mawr letter that also appeared on the question documents. It will be recalled that early in the investigation of this case, these examinations were made by the laboratory and a report was submitted indicating that it would be impossible for an expert to testify to the fact that because of similar or common errors, it followed that Priscilla Hiss actually typed the question documents. Mr. Murphy now desires that a complete review of these common errors be made, as he feels that although he probably will not be able to use this information on the government's case in chief. He might be able to point it out in summation.
I think you would be interested to see what happened at the second trial on that point. Well, and I have that also from Mr. Fian, the FBI documents examiner.
Yes, I would like to see it.
Let's take a look.
The United States of America against Alger Hiss. Summation on behalf of the government. In going over the documents, I noticed some common typing errors. When you get these documents inside, these Baltimore documents and the standards, look for similarity of mistakes.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think the person who is saying this is, what's his name? Tom Murphy. And he's saying this to the jury.
What point, then, is he trying to tell the jury here?
Well, it's apparent to me that he's indicating that Mrs. Alger Hiss may have typed the question material.
But there was no evidence of that, was there?
Not sufficient for me to reach a conclusion that she was the one who was responsible.
What do you think of that trial tactic?
Well, if there was no evidence, doesn't your question answer yourself?
If you've covered trials, and I've covered a lot of them, the lawyers worry about all kinds of things, and they worry, well, you open this subject where you get contradictory testimony from experts and so on. Drop it. Don't use it. All it does is complicate the case. On the other hand, it's perfectly permissible for the attorney summing up saying, well, compare the typing.
Well, let me put it this way, I wouldn't have done it. The atmosphere in which the case was tried, first tried, and then tried again, has a powerful effect upon jurors. The atmosphere was deadly.
Veterans groups parade before today's concert in protest against the gathering in Peekskill of the left-wing Robesonites from New York. 900 state and local police keep order for a while. At almost the same time these pictures were made, from Moscow come films showing Mr. Robeson singing a communist song during his recent visit to Russia.
When the concert was over and we got in our cars, we saw these people lined up with great big rocks, young people, old people, and they just threw these rocks.
Police efforts to keep the peace are unsuccessful, and for 5 hours the fighting rages over 10 square miles of countryside.
And people got hurt. We were hit with glass. It was really like we were in Nazi Germany.
The state orders an investigation into the bloody and ominous discord in this Sunday music from Peekskill.
Well, we were asked not to read newspapers. But you couldn't help it since you went home every day and you bought a newspaper every day. And quite often the jurors, some of the jurors would bring the newspapers in and go over it and would make fun of the way the newspaper reported the trial. But I don't think reading those, even if we did read a little bit of the case, had any influence on either or any of us. I was a good juror on the case. I mean, went in with an open mind, put it that way. And it was quite a long trial. 6 weeks is quite a long time to sit on a trial like that. And we all knew that the trial was of national importance at that time because of all the high politicians that were involved in it. And more or less the security of the country, because at that time we were very aware of the communist movement in the United States trying to transfer all or any information over to Russia that they could.
Dean Acheson's qualifications for Secretary of State are aired by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Acheson tells the senators that Alger Hiss, indicted former State Department official, never was his assistant, and says,
Mr. Alger Hiss was an officer of the Department of State during most of the time that I served there. During that time, he and I became friends, and we remain friends.
All hell broke loose when I went out at the University of Washington. One of the regents and the American Legion Loyalty Committee and several others came down on my head. And I figured that the Hiss case had cost me $40,000 pre-inflation dollars just to testify twice for his. The importance of my testimony was simply that in 1940, Chambers thought that Francis Sayre was head of the underground apparatus and never mentioned Hiss once, and that he turned around and Hiss in the years after that for what reason I don't know, and left Sayre completely out of it.
I saw Chambers about once a week. In the middle of the case, a good many of his friends, his former friends, had turned on him, or not turned on him, but deserted him.
My dear children, one autumn twilight, in the quiet, there suddenly swept over my mind a clear realization of our true position. Obscure, all but friendless people. Against me was an almost solid lineup of the most powerful groups and men in the country. A sense of the enormous futility of my effort and my own inadequacy drowned me. I felt a physical cold creep through me, settle around my heart, and freeze any pulse of hope. The sight of you children, guiltless and defenseless, was more than I could bear. John began to call me in the cow stable, in the milk house. I walked over to him. "Papa," he cried, and threw his arms around me. "Don't ever go away." "No," I said, "no, I won't ever go away." Both of us knew that the words "go away" stood for something else, and that I had given him my promise not to kill myself. Later on, I was tempted in my wretchedness to break that promise.
Chambers attempted suicide on the eve of the first trial. Certainly the jury should, in my opinion, have been advised of that fact. If we had been advised of it, in order to lay a basis for an inference that he was attempting to do away with himself because of a guilty conscience.
Stryker, my trial counsel in the first trial, said a number of times at the end of the day when we were back working as lawyers for the next day's session, going over the minutes that were produced and going over tactics. "Alger, didn't he ever make a pass at you?" And I had to say, no, he hadn't. He said, "Oh, so clear that this is a rejected homosexual. If only you could remember a pass which you parried, then the jury would understand it. Otherwise, they'd have trouble with the motive."
I was trying to find motive. And that's the one thing I couldn't find. I could see nothing that would be attracted between the two men.
They were completely opposite. And that's why perhaps some of the jurors couldn't realize that Hiss would associate with someone of that character.
These are two of the FBI documents we have received about Chambers' homosexuality, both dated in February 1949, some months, 4 or 5 months before the trial even began.
I don't remember if that was brought up at the trials or not. I don't recall it.
No, it wasn't.
Oh,
it's only been brought up within the last 2 years, 1976 and 1977. Let me show you a piece of an interview of Alger Hiss reading statements by Whittaker Chambers that he made to the FBI a few months before the first trial began, because it deals with the question of motive. So,
good.
Let's take a look.
These are two of the FBI documents we have received about Chambers' homosexuality, both dated in February 1949. Sometime in either 1933 or 1934, I met a young fella on the street in New York City. Since I was more or less footloose and fancy-free, I took him to a hotel, the name of which I cannot now recall. During the course of our stay at the hotel that night, I had my first homosexual experience. It was a revelation to me. Because it had been repressed so long, it was all the more violent when once set free. It set off a chain reaction in me which was almost impossible to control. Since that time, and continuing up to the year 1938, I engaged in numerous homosexual activities, both in New York and Washington. I actively sought out the opportunities for homosexual relationships. I recall that incidents of this nature took place in the Hotel Annapolis, and the Hotel Pennsylvania in Washington, D.C. I registered in these hotels under assumed names, which I cannot now recall. I would describe my homosexual activity as being in the most elementary form. In 1938, I managed to break myself of my homosexual tendencies. This does not mean that I am completely immune to such stimuli. It does mean that my self-control is complete and that for years I have lived a blameless and devoted life as husband and father. It will be noted that three things of some great importance happened during the year 1938. First, my cessation of my homosexual activities, my final break with the Communist Party, and my embracing for the first time religion. I do not believe that the cessation of my homosexual activities and my break with the Communist Party were in any way connected with each other. I tell it now only because in this case I stand for truth. Having testified mercilessly against others, it has become my function to testify mercilessly against myself, though he never testified to this publicly. I've said before that I am consciously destroying myself. This is not from love of self-destruction, but because only if we're consciously prepared to destroy ourselves in the struggle can we fight the thing, can the thing we are fighting be destroyed. At the very end of these statements, the FBI agent, who was Edward Scheidt, the FBI special agent in charge, added this closing paragraph. It is pointed out to the Bureau that Chambers has never heretofore made this part of his life known. It was first told to agents in the Bureau February 16, 1949. In view of this, it is suggested that insofar as any dissemination of this information outside the Bureau is concerned, that it be treated in a strictly confidential manner. In other words, it's clear they did not want us to find out about it.
It's quite revealing.
I would still have to know about those papers. I wouldn't accept this. This is Hiss in his own defense. These are self-serving papers.
No. These are FBI documents in Chambers' own handwriting and FBI interviews of Chambers.
I believe if that would have come out at the time of the trial, there would have been no trial.
What Mr. Hiss was reading that you just saw are exactly what Whittaker Chambers told the FBI in 1949. So I think we must accept the FBI's memoranda as a correct statement of what Whittaker Chambers told them. But it was withheld by the FBI until 1976 for almost 30 years.
I don't think they'd ever get a jury to believe someone like that on the stand. Not that it really makes that much difference, but at that time, it would make a world of difference. The world has changed in the last 15, 20, 30 years.
As I recall it, I think I was the one who asked him the question, are you a homosexual? He's under oath, and he denied it.
It was the whole situation has changed in public opinion from 1949 and 50, when my case was being tried, and now all to the good. It isn't really directly relevant to whether he was telling the truth. It is indirectly. On the issue of motives, I bring it up now only in terms of its possible relationship to many other incidents of FBI suppression of evidence that might have been helpful to me.
At that time, it probably would have made a big impression on it because that thing was really suppressed back 30 years ago. And then would have made a big impression on me. But maybe if those 4 for acquittal would have argued at that point. We probably would have went to their side.
Denying the vindication he sought, Alger Hiss with his wife leaves New York's federal court. His 6-week trial resulting in a hung jury. A jury of his peers which could not reach the unanimous decision required by law, but which stood 8-4 for conviction. With trial judge Kaufman a center of controversy as the government prepares for another trial of the more than ever baffling perjury case.
You asked me if I have any statement to make on the outcome of the Hiss trial in New York. It seems to me, in view of what has happened, that it is not necessary to make any statement at all. You also asked me what I think I have been doing by my activities in the past year. I am a man who grudgingly, reluctantly, step by step, is destroying himself so that this nation and the faith by which it lives may continue to exist.
The prosecutor immediately announced there would be a new trial, and that finally took place in November that same year, 1949.
I'm Gussie Feinstein, and I was juror number 8 on the second Alger Hiss trial, at which time we convicted him of perjury in 2 degrees. Ada Condell, who was our forelady, had a friend who was on the first jury. And when this was over, she had us over to her home for lunch to meet this friend who was on the hung jury. And we discussed the trial there. And it was the opinion of this one juror that on their panel, where they had the hung jury, she thinks 2 of the jurors were communists. I was picked on the second 50 jurors that came up because many excused themselves for the reason that they would be prejudiced. And I was kept on, and I was pleasantly surprised because I felt that it was going to be an interesting experience for me, and it was. I couldn't believe that this man, who was instrumental in being the secretary of the conference that formed the United Nations, and he was secretary of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, would go against the government.
But Whittaker Chambers said that Alger Hiss was a communist.
Yeah, but he said that, and Mr. Hiss denied it.
And whom did you believe on that question?
I believed Mr. Hiss. And my impression was he was covering up.
For?
I don't know. I wish I knew. I think his wife, I think she was the commie. Maybe I'm wrong.
Do you recall if there was any evidence that she was a communist?
No, none whatsoever. The only 2 that there was evidence in the witness stand that they were communists was Mr. Chambers and Mrs. Chambers. And it wasn't only my feeling. You know, when I went home, I used to go home with the Mary Elders. She lived on, she had a change at 125th Street for the Pelham Bay line, and we would talk. And she felt the same way that I did. She'd say to me, Gussie, he's covering up for somebody.
Did you see the newspapers?
Yeah. I read it occasionally, but not much, because we were told not to. But it had nothing to do with my decision whatsoever. As the judge charged us from the bench, he said, you've got to take no matter how you feel personally, you've got to take the testimony from the witnesses and plus my charge and make up your mind. And this is what we all did. Our little differences we discussed amongst each other, we resolved them, and we came to a decision of guilty. There was no question that he was guilty of perjury. The government proved it to our satisfaction with the documents showing the typewriter was in the courtroom and blown up exhibits of the documents that were supposed to have been typed on this, showing the defects in the letters that matched exactly to the defects in the typewriter. That's what really convicted him. He should have taken that typewriter and destroyed it after he found it, because the documents without the typewriter corroborating the discrepancies, if he didn't have the typewriter there, you couldn't prove it. The government couldn't prove anything. They were typed on his typewriter. What I don't understand about the whole thing, why Alger Hiss made such an effort to find that typewriter, and why, when he did find it, he didn't break it up into little pieces and melt it down.
Would you have done that?
Oh, yes, if I was guilty, I sure would. I wouldn't leave that typewriter laying around for anything.
I have been asked over and over again, why did we put the typewriter in evidence? Well, a number of reasons. I think the basic one is that I felt, as I still do, that all the evidence, all the facts should be made public. But it is also important to remember that it, in no sense, supported what Chambers was saying, because we had given our machine, which we believed to be this one, to the Catletts when we were moving from one house to another at a date that preceded the date of any of the Chambers type documents, so-called Baltimore documents. Now, at the trial, the prosecutor managed to confuse and diminish the credibility to the jury, the value of the testimony of the two Catlett boys. He, as a clever cross-examiner, cast doubt upon when they had received it.
I'd taken the typewriter down to a typewriter mechanic on Pennsylvania Avenue, and they said that that typewriter was beyond repairs. And I brought the typewriter back home. Then I give it to my sister.
The FBI picked me up. I was going to work. They drove me to the FBI station doing 65 miles an hour, siren wide open.
The FBI despaired of ever finding the typewriter. It was traced from person to person to person to the person that Hiss's lawyers got the typewriter from.
And they came back at another time. You see, after the typewriters showed up, then the officer Jones, which was in charge, they put me in the car. We went over to Rosslyn, Virginia at the open air market, and they bought me beer. You know, I drank it. And they, was telling me that they would have given me more money than the Hisses if I had turned it over to them, the typewriter, the information to them.
And his testimony, they plied him with beer to get information out of him. And the whole jury laughed, and Judge Goddard let us laugh, too. He never even stopped to see himself laugh.
Mr. Murphy, which he got somewhat mad with me when I told him about Jones offering me this and giving me the beer. Then they called for a recess. And that was the end of my part in the trial.
I was surprised that Mr. Murphy let him go on the way he did, because after all, he was talking about the FBI men. his own department. You know what I mean? He was really a tiger, how he went a tooth and nail at those witnesses. Of course, that was his job. When I saw him several years later, when he called me into his chambers, I couldn't get over that this is the same person. Because at that time, he was a judge. As a result of this trial, he became a judge. Like comedy and tragedy, that's what the trial was, comedy and tragedy. Because it was tragedy. To think that a man who had achieved so much had to end up with nothing. And it hurts. Even though he was wrong, I'll never forget it. When the clerk of the court read the guilty verdict, the terrible sound of disappointment that came from everybody, I don't know who it was oh! They couldn't believe that he was found guilty. This is the feeling I got.
The verdict is a great victory for the democratic process. I hope the American people will realize the debt that they owe to this jury, to Mr. Murphy, and to the tireless and splendid efforts of the FBI. Nor should they forget Congressman Nixon of California, who almost single-handedly forced the House Committee on Un-American Activities to pursue the Hiss investigation.
I couldn't look at him when we brought in the verdict. I felt terrible about the whole thing. But we couldn't help ourselves. We had no other choice.
I forgot many things about the trial. But I walked out of there actually with a broken heart, because that man, Alger Hiss, was a good man. I think he was loyalty to his country and the president that he served. I don't believe today that that man has did anything dishonest.
I think that was the dirtiest thing that was ever done to a man, a human being. I cried many times about that thing. It's awful.
Mr. Catlett, take a look at the typewriter.
Well, I know it's been cleaned. It's been cleaned up. This works good. Because you used to work it, and the key would get up here, and the next one would get up, and it would stay. You had to take and pull the keys down. Like they would hang up right like what's in this position here, with the next key locking over.
You know, I've often wondered whether there wasn't two typewriters and where I was living. Whether they didn't get the wrong one, because my uncle had a typewriter and he bought a new one. I don't know whether he had an old one or not. Maybe that's how they got mixed up.
But the Hisses admitted it was their typewriter in court.
They indeed thought that it was.
This is the only reason we could base our surmise that it was because they admitted that it was.
Well, the typewriter I had caps that fit down over these ribbons, and I wasn't supposed to smoke in the house. And so therefore I would take the caps off of these ribbons, the ribbon typewriter I had, and use the caps for ashtrays. And when I put the typewriter under my dressing table and threw the caps in the yard. This definitely, right here, I don't care what they change with the keys, this mine had caps on it.
But somebody's taken the caps off this machine, so it could...
The caps belong on that.
But anybody can take them off.
Well, you mean tell me a cap fits over here? It doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like it's made for a cap to fit over that. That looks like it was all to it.
Oh, how did you get that? I borrowed it from his lawyers. You could check the serial number.
Oh, it's the other way around. Right. It looks like N230099. This is a Newsweek story, July 24th, 1961, written at the time of Whittaker Chambers' death and purports to be a capitulation of the case. The first sentence is, there was the typewriter, an aged Woodstock number 200194, on which state secrets allegedly had been typed. That's not the number. Now, how Newsweek got that number, I don't know. This one is very obviously written from the clips. Probably from the stories I wrote for Newsweek myself.
Suppose Newsweek is right about the lower number.
Well, it would mean that there's some very funny somewhere.
Interestingly enough, Mr. Stryker, with his acute sense of the drama of a trial, was aware that something that we didn't know was wrong with the typewriter. He said to me a number of evenings when we went to his office to go over the day's results, prepare for the next day, something's wrong with that typewriter. Mr. Murphy is afraid of it. We should worry about it because it's being used so much against us. He dances around it as though it were a hot stove. He never touches it.
Nixon had information from the FBI laboratories that the Hiss typewriter was used in the typing of material, State Department material that was submitted to the Soviet espionage apparatus. And that was FBI laboratory work that was not made known to the general public until the Hiss trial.
Nixon wrote a book called 6 Crises, and I apparently was one of his crises. In fact, I think the Hiss case is crisis number 1. On December 13, FBI agents found the typewriter. My lawyers issued a statement saying they welcome this confirmation that the typewriter we found, 230099, was not the typewriter that had been ours, as we believed. And immediately, Nixon announced in reply that he had been in error about the case that was so important to him, and that it was a researcher's mistake, which he had relied on. In all future editions, what I just read is changed to read as follows. On December 13, FBI agents were unable to find the typewriter.
FBI memo, teletype, May 17th, 1949.
Before the first trial.
Yeah. Concerning Woodstock typewriter serial number N230099, allegedly the typewriter formerly owned by the Hiss family, it is desired to point out, in the event this has not previously been considered, that the definite possibility exists this typewriter is not the one received by Priscilla Hiss from her father, Thomas Fansler.
From her father, Thomas Fansler. The investigation to date has established that the Fansler-Martin partnership purchased a Woodstock typewriter in 1927.
230099 would have been manufactured in 29.
This point never came up in the trial.
You are correct. It has only been disclosed in the last couple of years that the FBI doubted that the machine in court was in fact the Hiss family Woodstock. If you'll look at this FBI memo
of a Woodstock typewriter, which comes within the pertinent serial range, that is 145,000-204,500, which was manufactured around the time that the Hiss Woodstock machine was made. Now, the typewriter that was exhibited at the trial was 230099, and this was the number of the typewriter that was shown to the jury in the courtroom at the trial.
How does that number compare with the FBI's pertinent serial range?
It's nowhere near it.
Where is it?
145,000 up to 204,000. Now, the typewriter that was in the courtroom was 230, so it's way above that range.
Yes.
And the Newsweek article has it within the range. It's very confusing. Why didn't they come out with this information before so we could make a correct evaluation on the testimony that's put in front of us? We're not mind readers. I think it's highly, very inconsistent and very bad. And it leaves a lot of doubt in my mind on the motives behind this disclosure. Not motives behind not disclosing this fact at the trial. The one in court did type those documents, but by this evidence, it wasn't his typewriter.
That typewriter sitting there in court was used to damage the defense further by the prosecutor having an FBI agent come into the courtroom, sit down at a table, and type with that ancient Woodstock typewriter simply to establish apparently that it was still usable. And the clicking of the keys was a sound that I vividly remember and was not very helpful to the defendant.
It's, I can't conceive of any federal department holding back such vital information in a case. And what's so highly secretive about a typewriter that they couldn't reveal it at the time?
But they did not reveal it until
30 years later. That's a long time. And I really don't know what would have happened. I just don't know. I don't think it's fair to anybody who goes on trial. Here's a man that might have been proven innocent and not guilty if the jury had known that the typewriter that was presented to us in the courtroom wasn't the Hiss's typewriter. It was another typewriter.
Let's not go so far as to say that the typewriter was not the Hiss typewriter. Let's just say what the FBI did, that they had some doubts about it and some strong evidence that it was not.
I'm sure Mr. Murphy had access to the FBI files. I'm sure the FBI would let him go into their files for that bit of information. In other words, if he had access to these files and could find out that that wasn't the typewriter that was shown to us in the courtroom, then I say that we were hoodwinked. The jurors were hoodwinked.
My job was, as an assistant United States attorney, to present the facts to an American jury. And that jury, by its determination, I think, has permanently sealed the issues that were created by this case. I want to take this occasion, too, to thank the members of the staff who worked with me, particularly all of the men of the FBI who so diligently and carefully prepared the evidence. Thank you.
They misled us about what they knew. They misled the judge, who actually, in charging the jury, said the government had proved that this particular typewriter was the one that had been used to type both sets of paper. And it had a powerful psychological impact on the jury, no question. It was sitting there like the murder weapon all the way through.
When Hiss was in prison, his lawyers moved for a new trial based in part on evidence that the typewriter in court was the wrong typewriter. They tried to pursue it then. The government at that point ridiculed their position that the typewriter in court was possibly not authentic.
I can't understand why they ridiculed him. if they themselves had the doubt too?
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, it's a good question, I think.
After the appeal was denied by the Circuit Court of Appeals, the Second Circuit in New York, my counsel took a petition for certiorari. That is a means of getting the Supreme Court to review a restricted number of cases.
Justice Douglas has a chapter on the witch hunt and the New Deal in his autobiography, Go East, Young Man. He writes that the Supreme Court would have reversed your perjury conviction for lack of corroboration, but that the court did not even take your case. Can you explain what he means by all that?
The point that Douglas makes, and it does get a little intricate, was that two members of that court, Justice Felix Frankfurter, who had been my teacher and was a personal friend, and Justice Stanley Reed, with whom I had worked when he was Solicitor General, who had testified for me in my trial, therefore, of course, had to disqualify themselves from considering my request for the Supreme Court to consider it. And Justice Douglas says in the passage you refer to that had they not been witnesses for me, and had they not felt they would have to disqualify themselves on some other ground, had they voted with him and Justice Black to take the case, it would have been taken. And then he went on to say, had the case been heard by the court, he thought no court, meaning no Supreme Court, could have upheld the decision below because there was no independent corroboration. The fact that Chambers said the typewritten pages had been typed by my wife, meaning with my approval and my direction, wasn't independent. It was still his statement. He was still the sole witness.
Handcuffed to a common criminal, Alger Hiss leaves a U.S. Marshal's office in New York to serve a 5-year prison term. The ex-State Department advisor to President Roosevelt still protests his innocence.
The counter-revolutionary purge is still to come, said Chambers in 1940. Well, it came. McCarthy was one consequence.
This attack on me by Senator McCarthy. It is impossible for anyone to estimate the harmful effect that these innuendos have had on the success of my mission and the foreign policy of the United States.
We have been receiving anonymous telephone calls at all hours of the day and night, accompanied by threats and profanity. With such advice as this, Mr. Chairman, get out of this neighborhood, you communists, or you will be carried out in a box.
From a housewife in the village near my farm, Mrs. Hanson got word of a petition being circulated, calling my family undesirable and asking us to get out of the community. In this country, the word communist stands for an individual who is a sneak, a thief, a liar, a traitor.
The repression increased rather than decreased after the verdict in my case, because McCarthy didn't even wave his piece of paper in Wheeling, West Virginia until about 2 weeks after my conviction.
I think Senator McCarthy is more dangerous to freedom in the United States than all the communists we have in this country.
Don't you think, sir, that Senator McCarthy's methods might be justified, and that the House Un-American Activities Committee's methods might be justified because of a failure on the on a part of the Department of Justice? After all, the FBI knew of the existence of Alger Hiss for 4 or 5 years before he was prosecuted.
Well, I'll grant you Hiss, but for heaven's sake, you're not going to fund all your policy on the fact that one man was found guilty of having done something improper in 1938 and lied about it in 1948. I'm not afraid of the communists in the United States. There never has been a more futile political movement in the United States than that of communism. After 25 years, they can't get enough votes to keep their name on the ballot. This idea of finding the communist stone under the bed seems to me all nonsense. And the result of the whole thing is that Americans now are so timid about expressing themselves that we've practically given up democratic methods and free speech.
Creativity
and initiative were deadened by reason of the paranoia of the McCarthy period, by McCarthyism, if you will.
We have been accused of branding the books. We do not ask that the book be branded. The stamp does not read that this book is subversive and teaches and advocates communism. It is a stamp that will give the affiliation of the author. It will state that the author has been affiliated with from 1 to 10, 40 to 50, 70 to 85 Communist Front affiliations cited by the Attorney General of the United States or the House Un-American Activities Committee. Therefore, it brands the author more or less, but not the book. And if the author has these many affiliations, I feel that he certainly should be branded, and the people should be entitled to know that this author does have pro-communist leanings.
I can't conceive of any good American objecting to removing the books by communist authors from the bookshelf.
And after McCarthyism had made its impact, we began to make mistakes. The prime mistake, of course, was the Vietnam War.
I believe in congressional investigations because I know that if it had not been for the investigations conducted by the Committee on Un-American Activities, Alger Hiss would be free today.
Chambers remarked that this was a tragedy of history.
No, I'm afraid I can't see it that way. In some ways, it was a personal tragedy for me, mostly in terms of my marriage. This did have tragic results. A tragedy of history in some overall Spenglerian sense? No, I think that's more of Chambers' self-inflation. I think my marriage definitely was one of the casualties of the case. It was too much for Priscilla, a very private, very sensitive person, to take without psychic injury to her and without affecting the relationship between us so adversely that after I came back from Lewisburg, it became clear after a year or two that we just could not continue living together.
Federal Penitentiary, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. The press is out in force for the release of prisoner number 19137. He is the former State Department official Alger Hiss, and you can see him now accompanied by his wife, their 13-year-old son, and 2 attorneys. Hiss is 50 years old. He went to prison for perjury, having denied passing state secrets to a courier for a communist spy ring. His 5-year sentence was reduced to 3 years, 8 months for good behavior. As a helicopter hovers noisily overhead, he meets the press. He says he'll resume his efforts for vindication. And so, Alger Hiss is a free man. But as a convicted felon, he cannot vote, nor ever hold federal office, nor practice his profession of law, nor can he ever get a passport to travel abroad.
What is your view of our criminal justice system that produced the result in your case?
Well, I think we have the best criminal justice system I know of anywhere in the world. No human instrument is immune from that kind of occasional misuse or inability to surmount what are all too human pressures. Now, in general, I can only repeat what I said before. We've got the best judicial system I know. I have no grievance against it as such. I merely have a burning desire to have my case of miscarriage of justice corrected.
Why do you insist upon bringing this matter up repeatedly? Why not just let people forget about it?
I can't forget about it. I'm innocent. I intend continually to press for every opportunity that I possibly can to get the verdict reversed.
We probably would have arrived at not a conviction, that typewriter wrote, was typed by the Hisses. But the second part of perjury, the part that he claimed he didn't know, he never met Whittaker Chambers, we'd have to convict him on that.
No. The second count was that he did not see Whittaker Chambers after January 1st, 1937.
That's right.
He was charged on 2 counts of perjury, and we knew that both of them went together, that you couldn't convict on one and acquit on the other.
This bulky document is a petition which we filed the end of July. The purpose of my action, called a petition for coram nobis, is to wipe the conviction off the records.
When it can be shown at any time after the case that the prosecution presented testimony or documentary evidence they knew to be a fabrication, this is such a violation of the fundamentals of our law that the case can be thrown out.
The case has been with you personally for some 30 years, and in all that time, your position has been that you have been a victim of a miscarriage of justice. Most victims of a miscarriage of justice feel or show anger or bitterness at their fate. Did you ever?
The 2 people who up until now, I reckoned as chiefly responsible for the charges against me, Nixon and Chambers, I found and still find it hard to have any personal anger. I was convinced early on that Chambers was not mentally responsible. But you can hardly feel prolonged anger at someone who isn't responsible for his action. Nixon I have always regarded from the very beginning as an opportunistic politician. He didn't know me personally. There could be no feeling on my part that he was breaching a relationship of friendship or anything of that sort. And I knew enough about politicians to know what political ambition sometimes leads people to do. But Murphy was himself an officer of the court, and I was angry almost continually, and I'm sure I showed it in some instances in the course of his cross-examination, because I thought that he stooped. I thought that it was not my idea of a fair attempt to lay out the facts. Now, I suspect that even that wasn't thoroughly justified, because this is, I now know, the way that prosecutors are trained and hardened to behave.
The jury said he was guilty. He got a full review of that verdict. He got a full review in all the courts of the land. He got all the due process possible, and he still was found guilty. So as a lawyer, I simply say, I believe in our system of justice.
I frankly wouldn't convict a mangy dog on Chambers' testimony.
And everything he said in court should have been cut in half and then in half again, and what was left should certainly not be able to convict anybody of anything. This is the injustice that was done to Alger Hiss.
People said, how could Alger Hiss be a spy? You know, Johns Hopkins in the State Department. Well, those are the people who get involved.
If Alger Hiss proves his innocence, then I certainly would feel that a number of people had to fabricate evidence in a way that I can find it extremely hard to imagine.
I don't know of anything, any incident that occurred that would mitigate Mr. Hiss's situation.
I understand the Bar Association has reinstated him.
What difficulties have you encountered as you re-began your legal career?
Only lack of clients. Otherwise, none at all. No difficulty. I mean, paying clients.
What I'm interested now is, I've heard you're speaking on the witch hunt and everything, and we've looked back at the era. You've had your day in court. Let's say, hypothetically, you've reversed the perjury conviction. Where do you go from here now? What are your goals?
I don't have much further to go.
But it would seem that someone who is, no, I understand, obviously, but it would seem that someone who's been put out so much, don't you think you have a view or something? Isn't there some sort of, I guess, a book so that you can get rich like everybody else? That, like, don't you have some sort of commentary you want to say, or isn't there something you'd like to say to us tonight? Where
I thought I was commenting.
I understand the outline. I don't understand, or perhaps I don't perceive your actual, like what's your story? Where are you coming from?
I don't know how to make it plainer. My story. My story, my friend, is I was wrong, and I'm going to get it changed. Now that's an accomplishment. I will be quite pleased with that. I don't have to go anywhere very far after that.
All right.
That's been quite an effort and quite an accomplishment.
Will you seek to serve again in some sort of a governmental capacity if that's offered to you?
It's difficult for me to even walk across the platform. At 73,
I see.
I'm not sure. What do you suggest? I'm open to proposals.
Moscow, October 15, 1992, in the office of Colonel General Dmitry Antonovich Volkoganov, Counselor of the President of Russia, and Chairman of the Supreme Council Commission on KGB and Military Intelligence Archives of the former Soviet Union, General Volkoganov.
Несколько месяцев назад ко мне обратился господин...
A few months ago, I was approached by Mr. Lowenthal, who asked me to help set the record straight and establish the facts about the Alger Hiss case. I am indeed chairman of the Commission on the Fate of Americans who disappeared on the Soviet Union territory. This would seem to fall outside my terms of reference, but nevertheless, on humanitarian grounds, I decided to take up the case. Today I can state that the Alger Hiss story was a result of the Cold War. There was a time when any contact of any Soviet citizen too with an American official could easily be classified as espionage, collaboration, and so on. But I decided not to become too emotional and asked Mr. Primakov, head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, to provide me with documents that could shed some light on the Alger Hiss case and to instruct his staff to look through all archives to see whether Alger Hiss was indeed an agent of the intelligence services of the Soviet Union. I have personally visited that archive, the Foreign Intelligence Service archive. I talked to the staff there. We have analyzed a huge amount of documents and determined as a result that Alger Hiss, in his official capacity in the 40s, did have official diplomatic contacts with the Soviet representatives. But I emphasize normal working official contacts in his professional capacity. I have been able to establish that Alger Hiss was never recruited by the intelligence services of the United States. He was never a spy for the Soviet Union. And I believe the fact that he was convicted in the 50s was a result of either false information or a judicial error. I am not a legal expert. I am only a deputy of the parliament, and out of humanitarian considerations, I have taken up this job. And today, I can state once again that the Alger Hiss case was a result of the Cold War, which I hope has definitely become a thing of the past. I have prepared an opinion on the basis of a careful study of the documents, archive materials, in the light of which I can make a firm conclusion that Alger Hiss was not ever or anywhere recruited as an agent of the intelligence services of the Soviet Union. This conclusion is confirmed by documents and the opinion of the head of Foreign Intelligence Services of Russia. I would like to hand this document over to Mr. Lowenthal and believe that you can tell Mr. Alger Hiss that the heavy weight should be lifted from his heart. Here it is.
Many thanks, General.
This is all I can do, even though it took me quite a long time to come to this conclusion.
History and Alger Hiss appreciate the time you spent. It is of considerable historic significance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and please convey to Mr. Alger Hiss the best wishes of good health, and may he, in his advanced age, breathe freely and look with wide-open eyes at this wonderful, complex and multifaceted world of ours.
May I ask a question now?
Go ahead.
Did you find anything about Alger Hiss's accuser, Whittaker Chambers?
I only found that he was a member of the Communist Party, the American Communist Party. And I think that he also only had contacts through party channels. Could have had party contacts, but not intelligence contacts. Although I haven't specifically looked into this matter, but all members of the US Communist Party could have contacts, but only party contacts. And information could only be party information and not any kind of secret or spy information. But I want to stress it again. At that time, any contacts, here in particular in the Soviet Union, were regarded as unlawful. And I believe that in the McCarthy era, the witch hunt was at its peak in the United States as well. I believe that this whole story is a result of the old times, the times of the Cold War, which I would say again I hope will never come back.